The end of the 19th century was a fairly peaceful time for the industrialized world. The great powers found a way to get along in spite of old rivalries, and each was fairly prosperous. But there were tensions beneath the surface. The German Empire, which had been founded as recently as 1871, wanted to be regarded as an equal to Great Britain and sought to surpass it in military and economic might. European economies were grinding along, but governments were spending a lot on arms and armor. Within a few short years, the principles of free trade, which then prevailed, would be replaced with tariff and quota wars that would last for nearly a century. And the age of royalty, notably in Russia and Austria-Hungary, was about to be extinguished. The German Empire, formed by the unification of several states under the Prussian king, was surrounded by rivals, particularly France to the west. So in 1873, in order to balance European power and ensure peace, Germany allied with the Empire of Austria-Hungary and with the Russian Empire to form the Three Emperors League. The League had as one of its goals the control of Eastern Europe in order to keep the ethnic groups within the three empires in check. The Poles, as but one example, inhabited parts of the German Empire and the Russian Empire. But bickering broke out between Austria-Hungary and Russia over their respective roles in the Balkans, and Germany sided with Austria. These two German-speaking powers then invited Italy to participate in a new Triple Alliance. Russia left the League and together with France formed the Franco-Russian Alliance in 1894. This alliance stipulated that should Germany attack France or Russia, the other would come to its aid and attack Germany. The United Kingdom remained above the fray of continental rivalries for as long as it could. But as old dynastic politics again inserted themselves into relationships between states, Britain eventually sided with France and Russia, creating in 1907 the somewhat less emphatic Triple Entente. The terms of the Triple Entente did not require each country to go to war on behalf of the others, but stated that they had a moral obligation to support one another. So by the turn of the 20th century, the great powers of Europe had become polarized. And these problems would lead to the outbreak of the first really modern war, World War I. Now, we need to add to this mix a heightened international rivalry that grew out of the new imperialism of the late 19th century as European nations jockeyed for power and influence outside of the industrialized world, mainly in Africa, but also in Asia. The Germans were wary of French overseas expansion, while the British were concerned about the buildup of the new German Navy. The Germans wanted to increase the size of their fleet to be about two-thirds the size of the British seagoing force, which was the largest in the world. These concerns led to increased arms expenditures and what amounted to an arms race in which Great Britain and Germany focused on building bigger and more powerful steam turbine-powered ships. These large battleships were called dreadnoughts and named after the first ship in the class of British battleships called the HMS Dreadnought, meaning fearless. British military expenditures totaled $250 million the year before the war broke out, while Germany's totaled $300 million. Despite these numbers, the British Navy was already so large that the Germans could not hope to catch up. The arms race was only one of several factors that were increasing tensions among the industrial powers at the dawn of the 20th century. Domestic politics within the nations of Europe also contributed to the willingness of the countries to go to war. The idea was that a war would distract political agitation within a country and, for example, as France hoped, would return territories lost in 19th century wars. To a lesser extent, a return to protectionism at the end of the 19th century also contributed to the economic tensions and continued to plague Europe, though in general business was anti-war. When tensions were high, blockading trade was a common diplomatic measure. By 1914, the alliances between Europe's industrial powers had so often become entangled in conflicts, large and small, that war seemed inevitable. Now, the spark that actually touched off the First World War brought into sharp relief the territorial rivalry between Austria-Hungary and Russia over control of the Balkans. This seems like an out-of-the-way place for a world war to begin, so let me explain. After a military coup deposed the King of Serbia in 1903, a pro-Russian party took over Serbia's government. Well, Austria ruled parts of the Balkans, and the new Serbian military rulers spread anti-Austrian propaganda in an attempt to unite the Austrian-ruled Serbs with those in pro-Russian Serbia. Austria was intent on exerting and maintaining its control of the Balkans, and so in 1908, with Russian approval, it annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, which had been under Ottoman rule. But tensions were still high in the Balkans, and Austria and Russia jockeyed for power in the region. Between 1908 and 1912, a series of Balkan crises erupted as various small states sought independence from Turkish Ottoman rule in Constantinople. These tensions tested Europe's diplomatic entanglements, particularly the Triple Alliance between Germany and Austria, because Germany did not want to become embroiled in Austria's ambitions in the Balkans. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the presumptive heir to his uncle, the Austrian emperor, visited Sarajevo in Austrian-ruled Bosnia. A young radical Bosnian Serb, opposed to Austria's imperial aims in the Balkans, assassinated the Archduke and his wife. A few days later, Austria, reinforced by Germany's pledge to stand by it, declared war against Serbia. France, alarmed that Germany's role in the war threatened it, urged Russia to respond. And Russia, enraged by the attack on fellow Slavs, then declared war on Austria. Europe's web of alliances brought each major actor into play, including Great Britain. Once Russia declared war on Austria, Germany fulfilled its diplomatic pledges to Austria, its only real ally. So within only about a month, all of Europe was at war as the various alliances kicked in. Now, while free trade supporters cautioned against the harm war would do to the international economy, many people in Europe were actually enthusiastic about the conflict. Why? Well, at this point, nobody could really see what they were getting into. Nobody really thought the war would last very long, and the politicians had developed strategies for quick victories. Germany, for example, which expected to fight on two fronts against France in the west and Russia in the east, had developed a strategy, the so-called Schlieffen Plan. It called for initially concentrating the war in the west against France, which the Germans figured to knock out of the war in about 6 weeks, and then shift full bore to the Eastern Front against Russia. But things didn't go according to plan. The Germans overran Belgium and were poised to take Paris when they were forced to draw back in the face of British and French counterattacks. The Germans dug in, and so did the Allies. And by winter 1915, the two sides were facing each other across a 300-mile front. Over the next 3 years, this Western Front did not shift more than about 10 miles in either direction. In time, the two sides settled in for a long period of trench warfare. On the Eastern Front, the Germans and the Russians fought along thinly held ground, where fast troop movements covering a lot of territory were the norm. The Germans were able to drive the Russians back, but not to beat them, at least not right away. World War I was the first large-scale war between industrialized powers. New technologies came into play, like fast-moving iron and steel steamships with heavy guns. On land, new iron and steel tanks and other armored equipment was employed to great effect. World War I was also the first war to use the newly invented airplane for reconnaissance and for air and land battles. And in ocean waters, submarines caused havoc for merchant ships and warships alike. Well, the competing naval strategies of both sides eventually drew the United States into the war. The naval conflict also underlay an economic strategy, a war of economic attrition, that would have far-reaching effects. You see, only a few months after the outbreak of the war, Great Britain laid massive explosive mines in the North Sea in an attempt to blockade shipping into Germany and deprive the Germans of raw materials, most of which it imported. This, in effect, created a military zone at sea. The British did this because the Germans had scattered some mines of their own in the open water, which violated the rules of war. The Germans saw the British Royal Navy's response as an attempt to starve it into submission. So German submarines began preying on merchant ships. Now, attacking merchant ships was not against international law, especially because they could be carrying goods to help the enemy, but certain rules applied to how they would be engaged in combat. Anyway, in May 1915, a German U-boat stationed off the southern coast of Ireland fired on a British passenger and cargo ship christened the Lusitania. Whether there were guns on the Lusitania is unclear. It had gun emplacements, but it was carrying cargo from the United States to England, and the German ship violated international law when it decided not to warn the merchant ship that it would be fired upon. Had the ship been warned, the passengers and crew would have been able to get away in lifeboats before the Germans opened fire. But the Germans fired a torpedo, and the ship went down with all hands and passengers aboard, about 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. The United States announced that if the German Empire continued its submarine warfare against merchant shipping, it would declare war on Germany. The Germans backed off for a time and then resumed their submarine attacks. The United States declared war in the spring of 1917. The Americans actually lost hundreds of merchant ships during the war. It was, after all, one of the largest suppliers of provisions and war materiel to Western Europe during the war. By the end of 1917, Russia, undergoing revolution and armed rebellion at home, dropped out of the fighting because its new Bolshevik government had its own problems to settle and insisted on getting out of the war in Europe. Actually, people all over Europe began to question the underlying reason for the conflict. The public mood had clearly shifted from one of enthusiasm to one of exasperation as the war dragged on. That said, the German public had no real idea that its war machine was being beaten back by the combined forces of Great Britain, France, and the United States. Still, it had become clear in the German high command that an armistice was the only way to avoid exposing Germany to invasion. It was also clear in the minds of German leaders, except perhaps for Kaiser Wilhelm, that the end of the war was going to require political change. The German Reichstag passed a new constitution that allowed for universal suffrage and made the Chancellor answerable to the Reichstag, not the Kaiser. This created a constitutional monarchy in Germany. But the European victors were not satisfied with this. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson wanted the Kaiser to abdicate and for Germany to set up a new government. In Western Europe, some factions wanted to end the war by calling for a white peace, where national borders would simply return to where they had been before the conflict broke out. The United States was against this solution because the Allies had the potential to benefit from their victory. President Wilson saw the end of the war as a chance to reshape international relations. Wilson's hope was for a new era of more open worldwide diplomacy, national self-determination, often when as dictated by Allied powers, and a review of the 19th century colonial system. With the expectation of better surrender terms, Germans pushed for and got the Kaiser to abdicate. He fled to the Netherlands. But in his absence, it wasn't clear what kind of German government would emerge. The socialists were the largest political group in the country, but they were split between those who wanted a Russian-style revolution and more moderate socialists. The moderate socialists eventually formed a parliamentary style of government. What would the average Germans make of all of this? The armistice, when it finally came, took most Germans by surprise. Many of them felt betrayed by their military leaders, by the Kaiser, and by the new political changes. This attitude would have important repercussions over the next 2 decades as Germany tried to recover from the changes. We tend to think of war as a topic that mostly addresses questions of political and diplomatic history. But the First World War in particular had a profound effect on the world economy. There are several after effects that I want to focus on now. First, World War I put an end to the free trade policies of the industrialized nations. Blockades of the type that precipitated the German U-boat attacks in the North Sea and the English Channel, resulting in the loss of Lusitania, among other Allied merchant and military vessels, were very different from those employed to control seaborne trade in earlier centuries. By the 20th century, military technologies, such as large and accurate artillery pieces with great range, had developed that made it very difficult for ships to blockade individual ports. So embargoes and blockades could be put in place only at shipping choke points, such as in the English Channel. But by the 20th century, submarine technology had advanced to the point where navies could counter blockades to devastating effect. Not only did blockades curtail direct trade, but they put pressure on neutral countries to restrict trade with belligerents. We have already seen that the once neutral United States shipping was targeted by German U-boats. Likewise, the Allies exerted great pressure on Northern European neutral states to curb their trade with Germany. The belligerents put a variety of quotas in place to control the trade in key products and prohibited the trade in goods deemed essential for the war effort. Increasingly onerous tariffs were also applied that were explicitly protectionist in nature. Even Great Britain, the one nation that had adhered to free trade policies the most, instituted protective tariffs during the war and even more so afterward. Second, during the war, governments intervened directly in economic affairs to a much greater degree than they had previously. And by this I refer not only to regulation, but also to direct control of some aspects of the economy. This trend manifested itself in a variety of ways. Government expenditures increased significantly. In many instances, government expenditures in industrialized nations reached as high as 50 or 60% of gross domestic product. By comparison, U.S. government expenditures today account for only about 15 to 20%, or slightly higher, of gross domestic product, or GDP. And people complain that their taxes are too high anyway. Not only was the World War I level of such expenditures extraordinarily elevated, but governments often directed what would be produced and controlled raw materials for production. And they occasionally engaged directly in manufacturing as well. The United States, for example, saw a massive shift in wartime production to military goods, which meant that millions of workers were directed into wartime production and entered the armed forces as well. At the same time, several governmental agencies in the executive branch were authorized to control prices and production in key industries. 3 agencies in particular, the War Industries Board, the Food Administration, and the Federal Fuel Administration, were set up to control prices and production in economic sectors crucial for the war effort. In Great Britain, the Defense of the Realm Act of 1915 allowed for the government takeover of munitions factories. Only a few months later, the Munitions of War Act provided not only for government control of munitions factories, but actual state ownership. The coal mining industry was put under direct government control and essentially nationalized. The British government also took over management of the railroads and shipping. Now, bear in mind that this was in Great Britain, which before the war was one of the world's most ardent supporters of free trade and liberal economic policies. It was as close to a laissez-faire economy as any place in the world at the time. Now, Prussian efficiency is practically a stereotype, but the German economy was even more centralized than elsewhere during the war. Its war ministry controlled production and the supply of raw materials. By the end of 1916, the entire German economy had been put on a war footing. Prices were fixed, and the entire adult male labor force was mobilized, either for military service or for industrial production. The war ministry had the power to close inefficient factories and reorganize industry to meet the needs of the state. So free trade and laissez-faire economic policies in the industrialized nations were dead by the end of the First World War, even in countries that had embraced them before the war. And the volume of world trade fell during the war. This is, of course, a general statement, and the actual pattern of world trade during the war was far more complex than my statement suggests. Exports certainly fell due to the policies most of the belligerents had of restricting exports in order to bolster domestic supplies. The blockades I mentioned a moment ago were intended to restrict a country's ability to import goods. Imports into Germany remained stagnant or declined during the war, while imports into France skyrocketed, while those of Great Britain and Russia increased. While this affected these countries' balance of trade, the ability to increase imports was crucial to winning the war. The Allied blockades, then, had the desired effect. For countries outside of Europe, exports exceeded imports. The real winner, as far as foreign trade was concerned, was the United States, whose exports during the war far outpaced imports. So war economies were marked by increased protectionism in order to ensure self-sufficiency, and state-directed, regulated economic systems were put in place. This was deemed necessary for survival. One result of the war economy was the original development of what has since been called the military-industrial complex, a term first coined by former Army General and outgoing United States President Dwight Eisenhower in his farewell remarks to the nation in 1961. The military-industrial complex is a concept that's most often associated with World War II and the Cold War. But the close coordination and control of the economy by governments that began in World War I marks the birth of the military-industrial complex. This does not mean that governments simply took over their economies, as was the case in centrally planned economies, though that was a temporary expedient in many instances. Rather, it refers to industrial self-regulation by businesses and greater coordination between businesses and government with the aim of achieving victory in an all-out war. So what was the outcome of World War I? Well, the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 and 1920 consisted of 5 separate treaties, each with one of the countries that had lost the war. We tend to forget that the losers included not only Germany and Austro-Hungary, but also Turkey and Bulgaria. And Hungary was treated as a separate country after the war, which is where it obtained its current borders. The Treaty of Versailles is the best known of these treaties. It was the treaty dealing with Germany and was signed in the Hall of Mirrors at the Château de Versailles. The location was intended to humiliate Germany because after the French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War a few decades earlier, that is precisely where German Chancellor Bismarck in 1871 chose to declare the German Empire, though he and the Germans then departed to let the French govern themselves. Now, according to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was to return to France the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, which it had taken from France in 1871. Germany was also to demilitarize a 50-mile wide buffer zone along the French border, and the treaty required Germany to accept blame for the war and to pay war reparations for the losses incurred. The map of Europe changed drastically. Parts of Germany, Russia, and Austria were merged to form Poland, and the territories that Russia had ceded to Germany earlier as part of its strategy to exit the war became Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. The former empire of Austria-Hungary was divided, and great swaths of territory were carved away. Ethnic Czechs and Slovaks were forced into a combined state called Czechoslovakia, and the new state of Yugoslavia was formed out of various Balkan territories that had originally inflamed the European crisis. After centuries of existence as one of the world's great empires, Austria became a very small country and not allowed to merge with Germany. The treaties also had an effect in the Middle East as the Ottoman Empire that was centered in Constantinople was broken up. Turkish rule ended in the outlying territories of Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Iraq, among other places. These fledgling new states were set up as protectorates, initially under the control of France and Great Britain. The Arabs, not surprisingly, felt cheated and resentful that they were not given their full independence immediately, an issue that bred Middle Eastern resentment toward the Western nations that can still be felt today. So the First World War came to an end, but the settlements that wrapped it up left lingering resentments on all sides and failed to adequately address the colonial system that President Wilson had hoped to dismantle. Along the lines of 12 million soldiers died in the First World War, and another 10 million or so civilians died, either directly from the war or from the hardships and conflict imposed on them. Additionally, Russia alone lost as many as 16 million people. Following hard on the heels of combat and armistice was the outbreak of Spanish flu, in which millions more died by 1921. All totaled, this was Europe's greatest population shock since the Black Death in the 14th century. The economic costs of the war were enormous, especially in terms of physical destruction. The small kingdom of Belgium, which had been a major battlefield, lost half of its steel mills and 3/4 of the rolling stock on its railroads. France was almost bankrupted. The country's industrial production was almost halved, and 10% of French territory lay in ruins. Germany was even in more dire straits. The Versailles Treaty reduced its size and, most importantly, removed 75% of its iron ore and 25% of its coal mines. Not surprisingly, Germany's industrial production plummeted. It also lost almost all of its merchant fleet, and its entire navy was dismantled. The first years following World War I were a period of decline. Population loss, falling production, disruption of the pattern and volume of world trade, return to protectionism, all contributed to shattered economies. And to make matters worse, the huge debts that countries had accumulated to finance the war had to be paid off somehow. Inflation hit much of Europe hard after the United States, now Europe's largest creditor, insisted on being repaid in full. And as the German war reparations bill of over $30 billion came due. This was a bill that Germany could almost never hope to pay off. Unknown at the time, these problems created conditions that made a Second World War more likely. There were a few bright spots in all of this gloom. Industrial activity in North America increased during and right after the war. Industrial production in the United States increased by about 40% during the war years, while Canada's increased by 50%. The neutral European countries emerged from the war with stronger economies, though problems were on the horizon. Industrial production in South Africa, Latin America, and Japan began to shift the balance of world trade and industrial production away from Europe for the first time since the Industrial Revolution. The old order in Europe, from its receding royalty to outmoded industrial economy, was in decline, while wealth and productivity were on the rise in other parts of the world. The old order had been broken into pieces, but a new order had not fully taken shape. A few thinkers saw the problems brewing even before the outbreak of the war. President Woodrow Wilson in 1913 wrote, "The old political formulas do not fit the present problems, and they read now like documents taken out of a forgotten age. The older cries sound as if they belonged to a past age which men have almost forgotten." The world economy was in pretty poor shape after the war, and tougher times lay ahead.